The waitress wrote down something as she gave the Korean Mafia boss the receipt. What happened next shocked everyone. I had exactly 30 seconds to decide if I wanted to remain an invisible waitress or become a marked target for the rest of my life. My fingers trembled against the thermal paper of the receipt, the blue ink still wet and blurring under the pressure of my grip. I folded it once, then twice, until the warning was hidden in a tight square that felt like a live grenade in the palm of my hand. I stepped out from the shadows of the service station, the polished floor of the Gilded Lotus suddenly feeling like a tightrope. At table 1, Kang Jae-Hyuk sat with the terrifying stillness of a predator, his dark eyes focused on the menu while his security detail loomed like statues behind him. Beside him, Kwan Na was laughing, a light, musical sound that made my skin crawl now that I knew it was the sound of a woman counting down to her own fiancé's execution. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and Wagyu beef, but as I closed the distance to the table, all I could smell was the ozone of a coming storm. I wasn't just delivering a check. I was handing over a death sentence to the woman on the left, or a lifeline to the man on the right. I reached the edge of the tablecloth. 30 seconds were up. I slid the receipt toward his resting hand. The air in the Gilded Lotus wine vault was precisely 55 degrees, but sweat slicked my palms as I reached for the 2015 Bordeaux. It was a glass-walled sanctuary of fermented history, a place where the hum of the cooling system usually drowned out the world above. But tonight, the vents carried something more than cold air. They carried a voice, sharp, melodic, and chillingly calm. I froze, my hand hovering over a dusty label. Through the gap in the heavy steel door I had left ajar, I saw the reflection of Kwan Na in the polished mahogany of the cellar's outer lounge. She was supposed to be at table 1 with Kang Jae-Hyuk, playing the part of the devoted fiancée. Instead, she was paced the small, dim corridor, her silk dress rustling like a warning. "He's relaxed," she whispered into a sleek, encrypted phone. Her Korean was flawless, but it was the coldness in her tone that stopped my heart. "The security detail is already swapped. My father's men are the ones standing directly behind his chair now. They aren't his bodyguards anymore, they're his ghosts." I ducked behind a rack of vintage Merlots, my breath hitching in my chest. I knew who she was talking about. I'd served that table for 3 courses. I'd seen the men in the dark suits. Men I'd assumed were there to protect the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld. "The moment the dessert spoons hit the table, it's done," Nare continued, her voice sounding bored, as if she were discussing a change in catering. "Make sure the kitchen staff is pinned down. I don't want any witnesses. And the waitress, the black girl, if she's in the way, get rid of her too. She's seen too much of us tonight, anyway." A coldness that had nothing to do with the wine cellar settled into my bones. I wasn't just an observer, I was a loose end. I looked at the Bordeaux in my hand, the deep red liquid looking like arterial blood under the soft LED lights. Above me in the dining room, the Gilded Lotus hummed with the laughter of the elite, oblivious to the fact that a king was about to be toppled. I thought of my father, his medical bills piling up on our kitchen counter, and the quiet life I had fought so hard to build. If I stayed here, I might live, at least until they hunted down everyone who worked the shift. If I went up there, I was walking into a firing squad. But then I pictured Jae-Hyuk's eyes. They were intense, focused, and strangely human when he'd thanked me for the water earlier. He was a monster, perhaps, but he was a monster being led to a slaughter by the woman who claimed to love him. If this twist has you on the edge of your seat, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. There's more shocking stories ahead. My internal clock began to tick. The appetizers were cleared. The main course was finishing. I had less than 5 minutes before the dessert service began. Less than 5 minutes before the men I thought were protectors turned into executioners. I grabbed a corkscrew and a silver tray, my hands shaking so violently the metal rattled. I forced myself to breathe, to find the invisible waitress mask I had worn for 3 years. I couldn't be Amara the student or Amara the daughter. I had to be a ghost. I slipped out of the cellar just as Nare tucked her phone into her clutch and smoothed her hair. She turned, her face instantly melting into that beautiful, deceptive mask of a loving bride-to-be. She didn't see me in the shadows. She didn't know that the girl she'd just marked for death had heard every word. I started up the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. The weight of the secret was heavier than the tray I carried. I had to get to table 1. I had to reach him before the spoons hit the linen. And I had to do it without letting the executioners behind him see the terror screaming in my eyes. The industrial printer in the wait station spat out the bill with a mechanical screech that sounded like a scream in the quiet of the lounge. I grabbed the slip of thermal paper, my skin crawling as I felt the weight of the men in suits watching my every move from the dining room floor. They weren't bodyguards. They were predators waiting for a signal. I ducked behind the tall espresso machine, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. My reach for a ballpoint pen was clumsy, my fingers feeling like leaden weights. I had to be precise. I couldn't afford a long explanation or a frantic plea. I needed words that would pierce through Kang Jae-Hyuk's composure without alerting the woman smiling beside him or the executioners standing at his back. Asterisk, your fiancé sold you out. They're in position. Asterisk. 7 words. I watched the blue ink sink into the cheap paper, the letters slightly jagged from the tremor in my hand. I folded the receipt once, then twice, pressing the creases down until they were sharp enough to cut. This tiny square of paper was no longer just a bill for expensive wine and Wagyu beef. It was a detonator. If I handed this over, the invisible life I had cultivated, the quiet shifts, the nursing textbooks, the safety of my father's bedside was over. I would be stepping into the line of fire of an empire. A paralyzing wave of terror washed over me, pinning my feet to the floor. I looked at the swinging kitchen doors, the exit that led to the cold Chicago night and the mundane safety of my old life. I could just walk away. I could let the dessert spoons hit the table and let the bullets follow. I didn't owe this man anything. He was a titan of shadow, a man whose hands were likely as stained as the ones currently reaching for his life. But then I remembered the way Nare had dismissed me in the cellar. Get rid of her too. They weren't going to let me walk away, regardless. Whether I helped him or stayed silent, I was already a ghost in their eyes. I forced my legs to move, my sensible work shoes feeling heavy as I crossed the threshold back into the dining room. The gilded lotus felt different now. The amber lighting seemed sickly, the scent of the lilies cloying and funereal. Jae-Hyuk was leaning back, his dark eyes fixed on the city lights behind the glass, looking every bit the king of his domain. Beside him, Nare was daintily sipping the last of her wine, her expression one of bored elegance. The men behind them moved with a subtle coordination as I approached, their jackets unbuttoned, their hands hovering near their waists. They weren't looking at the room. They were looking at the back of Jae-Hyuk's head. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Don't look at them, I told myself. Asterisk, look at the table. Just the table, asterisk. I reached the edge of the white linen. The silence between us felt like a physical pressure, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the sound of gunfire. Jae-Hyuk didn't turn his head, but I felt his focus shift toward me, an intense, predatory awareness that made the hair on my arm stand up. Your check, sir, I whispered. My voice sounded thin, like it belonged to someone else. I didn't place the leather folder in the center of the table. I slid it directly toward his resting hand, my thumb pressing the folded note against the underside of the grain. For a heartbeat, our skin brushed. His hand was startlingly warm against my ice-cold fingers. I felt the moment his hand closed over the paper, the slight tension in his knuckles as he realized something else was inside. I didn't wait for a thank you. I didn't wait for him to open it. I turned and walked away, my back tingling with the sensation of a dozen sights trained on my spine, waiting for the world to explode behind me. The weight of the restaurant air seemed to double the moment I stepped away, leaving the thermal paper in Jae-Hyuk's possession. Behind me, the silence at table 1 was a living thing, expanding until it swallowed the clink of silverware and the low hum of jazz. I busied myself at the side station, my back turned, scrubbing a clean glass with a cloth that felt like sandpaper against my numb fingers. I could feel his eyes not on the note, but on the back of my neck, measuring the truth of what I had just handed him. Jae-Hyuk didn't scramble. He didn't reach for a weapon or signal his guards. Instead, the soft, rhythmic drumming of his fingers on the tablecloth stopped. I heard the faint, crisp crinkle of paper being unfolded, a sound that, to my heightened ears, was as loud as a gunshot. "Is something wrong, Jae-Hyuk?" Na-rae's voice drifted over, sweet as poison honey. "You look thoughtful." "Just the bill, darling," he replied. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, completely devoid of the panic that was currently clawing at my throat. "It seems we've overspent on the vintage. Or perhaps the service was simply more valuable than I realized." I risked a glance through the reflection of a nearby wine cooler. Jae-Hyuk was leaning back, the receipt now resting face down under his palm. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid with a slow, hypnotic grace. He looked at Na-rae, his gaze drifting from her eyes to the diamond necklace he had likely bought her, then back again. It was the look of a man re-evaluating every investment he'd ever made. "You're staring." Na-rae laughed, the sound light and brittle. "Do I have something on my face?" "Only a secret," Jae-Hyuk said softly. He reached out with his free hand, trailing a finger along the line of her jaw. She leaned into the touch, a practiced move of affection, but I saw the way his eyes remained cold, predatory, and wide awake. "Tell me, Na-rae, if the world ended in the next 30 seconds, would you be happy with how we spent our last meal?" The laughter in her eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat. The calm, amused mask she wore slipped, revealing a flash of something jagged and sharp. What a morbid thing to say. Why would the world end tonight? "Because the air feels thin," he mused, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He glanced up at the men standing behind him, the men who were supposedly his shields, but were now his executioners. "Don't you think so, Captain?" The lead guard shifted, his hand twitching toward the button of his suit jacket. The psychological pressure in the room was reaching a breaking point, a fever pitch of unspoken accusations. Jae-Hyuk was playing with her, pulling the wings off a butterfly to see if it would still try to fly. "I think," Jae-Hyuk continued, sliding the folded note toward the center of the table, his eyes never leaving hers, "that loyalty is a very expensive thing, and tonight it seems someone has decided to sell mine for a bargain." Na-rae's gaze dropped to the small square of paper. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her blush looking like bruises against her skin. She didn't reach for it. She didn't have to. The mere existence of the note was the confirmation of her treason. "Jae-Hyuk, I—" "Eat your dessert, Na-rae," he interrupted, his voice turning to ice. "The spoons are coming, and I'd hate for you to die on an empty stomach." The atmosphere wasn't just poisoned, it was lethal. I saw his hand slide beneath the table, and I knew the game of words was over. The physical world was about to catch up to the psychological one, and the Gilded Lotus was no longer a restaurant, it was a tomb. The transition from psychological warfare to physical slaughter happened in the space between two heartbeats. I saw the lead guard's hand move, not toward his radio, but toward the holster concealed beneath his tailored silk. He had seen the note. He had seen the shift in Jae-Hyuk's eyes. The betrayal was no longer a secret, it was a race. "Now!" Na-rae screamed, her elegant mask finally disintegrating into a jagged snarl of desperation. The world exploded. Before the guard could clear leather, Jae-Hyuk moved with a terrifying, liquid speed that made the rest of the room look like it was moving through amber. He didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the heavy oak table. With a guttural roar of focused strength, he appended it. The massive slab of wood slammed into the charging guards. A spray of crystal, fine china, and expensive wine erupting into the air like a fountain of glass and blood. Then the darkness came. A rapid-fire succession of pops echoed through the high ceilings, suppressed gunfire targeting the grand chandeliers. The magnificent glass fixtures shattered, raining diamond-sharp shards down on the screaming socialites below. The Gilded Lotus was plunged into a suffocating, strobing gloom, lit only by the frantic muzzle flashes from the back of the room. I was frozen, my back pressed against the cold marble of the service station, my lungs paralyzed by the smell of cordite and ozone. A stray bullet hissed past my ear, shattering a row of wine glasses inches from my head. I waited for the impact, for the end of a life that had been too quiet and too small for a storm this large. Instead, a hand like a vice clamped around my bicep. I gasped, ready to fight, but the silhouette looming over me was unmistakable. Jae-Hyuk's scent, expensive cologne, and sharp adrenaline hit me as he dragged me downward, shielding my body with his own as a second volley of gunfire chewed into the woodwork above us. "Stay low," he commanded. His voice wasn't panicked. It was the voice of a man who had been born in the dark and knew exactly how to navigate it. "If you stay here, you're a target. Move." He didn't give me a choice. He hauled me toward the service, swinging doors, his grip bruising but grounding. Around us, the restaurant had turned into a slaughterhouse. I heard Nare's voice shrieking orders over the chaos, her betrayal now a loud, bloody campaign. The men she had hired were moving through the shadows, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. We reached the industrial doors just as a hitman stepped out from behind the velvet curtains, his weapon leveled at Jae-Hyuk's chest. Without breaking stride, Jae-Hyuk grabbed a heavy silver serving tray from a nearby stand and hurled it with lethal precision. It caught the man in the throat, the clatter of metal followed by a wet, choking sound as Jae-Hyuk kicked the doors open. The kitchen was a nightmare of steam and steel. The chefs, caught between the warring factions, were diving for cover under stainless steel prep tables. The bright, clinical fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making the blood on Jae-Hyuk's sleeve look unnaturally bright. He didn't stop, dragging me past the oversized stoves and the walk-in freezers. "Why are you helping me?" I managed to choke out, my voice lost in the roar of my own heartbeat. He didn't look back, his eyes scanning the exits with a predatory intensity. "Because you chose a side, Amara," he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that sent shiver down my spine. "And in my world, we keep what we protect." Behind us, the doors to the dining room burst open again. The executioners had found the trail. The sanctuary of the Gilded Lotus was gone, and as Jae-Hyuk shoved me toward the back service corridor, I realized there was no going back to the girl who had arrived for her shift 4 hours ago. The glass had shattered, and the only thing left was the run. The kitchen of the Gilded Lotus had transformed from a temple of culinary precision into a labyrinth of silver and blood. The overhead fluorescents flickered, casting jagged shadows across the stainless steel prep tables where, moments ago, garnishes were being placed with tweezers. Now, those same tables served as a graveyard for shattered porcelain. Jae-Hyuk's hand never left my arm, his grip a constant, bruising reminder that the world had tilted on its axis. He moved with a predatory grace, navigating the maze of industrial stoves and steaming stockpots as if he had mapped the escape route 1,000 times in his mind. Behind us, the swinging doors groaned and buckled under the weight of the men following us, men who had traded their loyalty for Nare's promises. "Get down!" Jae-Hyuk hissed, his voice cutting through the roar of a burst steam pipe. He shoved me beneath a heavy butcher block island, just as a volley of gunfire ripped through the air. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the bullets punching holes through copper pans that hung from the ceiling, sending them clattering to the floor like funeral bells. I curled into a ball, the scent of industrial degreaser and raw onions stinging my eyes, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. A hitman in a blood-spattered chef's coat rounded the corner of the walk-in freezer, his silenced pistol leveled at Jae-Hyuk's head. He didn't hesitate. Jae-Hyuk grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the range, the metal still searingly hot, and swung it in a brutal arc. The impact was a sickening crunch of bone and metal. As the man stumbled, Jae-Hyuk disarmed him with a clinical efficiency that made my stomach turn. "Amara, look at me!" Jae-Hyuk commanded, crouching beside me. His face was a mask of cold marble, save for a spray of crimson across his cheekbone. He didn't look like a man in fear. He looked like a man in his natural element. "They are coming through the pantry. I can't hold the line and shield you at the same time. You have to move when I move." I looked at the exit, a heavy steel door marked service only, 30 feet away across a floor slicked with spilled oil and dishwater. Between us and the door stood another attacker, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. He raised a jagged kitchen knife, lunging toward us as Jae-Hyuk engaged a second shooter near the fryers. The invisible waitress was gone. The girl who had spent her life trying not to be noticed vanished under the sheer weight of survival. As the man reached for me, my hand closed around a heavy glass bottle of olive oil sitting on the edge of the prep station. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I swung the bottle with everything I had. It shattered against the side of his skull, a golden spray of oil and glass, shards erupting in the dim light. He went down hard, sliding across the tiles. I stood there, gasping, my hand still gripping the jagged neck of the bottle, the reality of what I'd done vibrating through my marrow. Jae-Hyuk was suddenly there, his eyes scanning me for wounds before settling on the broken glass in my hand. For a fleeting second, the coldness in his gaze wavered, replaced by a dark, shimmering respect. "Good," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that grounded my spiraling panic. "Keep that fire. We aren't out yet." He fired 2 rounds into the ceiling to suppress the remaining shooters, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos like a strobe light. In that brief, artificial lightning, I saw the exit. "Run," he ordered. We bolted. My work shoes skidded on the oily floor, but Jae-Hyuk's arm was a tether, hauling me forward through the heat of the ovens and the stinging smoke. We hit the steel door with the force of a battering ram, bursting out into the freezing Chicago night. The transition from the sweltering, metallic heat of the kitchen to the sub-zero bite of the winter wind was like a physical blow. But as the heavy door slammed shut behind us, I realized the girl who had entered that kitchen was dead. The survivor was the only one left. The transition from the kitchen's sweltering chaos to the dry storage annex felt like stepping into a tomb. The air here was stagnant, smelling of burlap sacks, dry jasmine rice, and the cold metallic tang of a world coming apart at the seams. Jae-Hyuk pushed me behind a stack of industrial-sized flour bags, his movements silent, his breathing deep and controlled. "Stay here," he whispered, his eyes scanning the dim shadows of the shelves. "The loading dock is just past those double doors. Once I clear the path, you don't stop until you hit the pavement." But the path wasn't clear. A heavy click echoed through the room, the distinct sound of a safety being disengaged. From behind a pallet of canned goods, a figure stepped into the pale light of a flickering security bulb. It was the man who had stood directly behind Jae-Hyuk for 3 years. His lead security, the shadow tasked with his life, was now the one holding the barrel. Jae-Hyuk didn't flinch. He slowly straightened his posture, the silk of his ruined suit jacket shifting as he faced his oldest ally. I wondered who Nare had promised the keys to, and "I should have known your price" was as cheap as her loyalty. An's face was a mask of regret and greed, his hands rock-steady on the weapon. "It's not personal, boss. Juno made me a better offer. Your brother thinks the Kang Empire needs a leader who doesn't spend his nights dining with vipers. He wants the throne, and he's willing to pay for the blood it takes to get it." The betrayal felt like a physical weight in the small room, a coldness that surpassed the Chicago winter waiting outside. Jae-Hyuk's brother, The hit wasn't just a lover's treachery, it was a fratricidal coup. Juno was always a better gambler than a soldier, Jae-Hyuk said, his voice dropping into a register that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of a man who had already decided how he was going to kill. He forgot the most important rule: don't miss the king. He didn't miss, and countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He just sent me to finish the job. The storage room erupted. Jae-Hyuk moved before the first muzzle flash illuminated the dark. He dove toward a row of metal shelving, pulling it down with a thunderous crash of falling cans and twisted steel. The sound of gunfire followed, sharp, deafening cracks that chewed into the bags of rice beside me. White grains erupted into the air like a localized blizzard, rice rain, that coated the floor and blurred my vision. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands over my ears, as the two men traded fire in the narrow aisles. This wasn't the cinematic shootout of the kitchen. This was a claustrophobic, desperate struggle between two men who knew each other's every move. I saw Jae-Hyuk roll behind a pillar, his weapon barking twice. A scream of pain followed, and I saw him stumble, blood blooming on his shoulder. But the traitor didn't stop. He fired blindly into the shadows, the bullets ricocheting off the concrete walls with a high-pitched whine. "Amara! The door!" Jae-Hyuk roared over the noise. I realized then that I was the distraction. As I pivoted toward the sound of Jae-Hyuk's voice, I grabbed a heavy metal canister of salt from the shelf above me and hurled it with every ounce of terror-fueled strength I possessed. It didn't hit him, but it slammed into a stack of glass jars, sending a cascade of shattering shards toward his face, and flinched, shielding his eyes for a split second. It was the only opening Jae-Hyuk needed. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his silhouette a blur of lethal intent. There was a sickening thud, a muffled groan, and then the heavy silence of a body hitting the concrete. Jae-Hyuk stood over his former friend for a heartbeat, his chest heaving, his face splattered with a mixture of rice, dust, and crimson. He didn't look back at the man he'd just broken. He turned to me, reaching out a hand that was steady once more. "The betrayal is finished," he said, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying light. "Now comes the war. Run." The heavy steel service door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the rhythmic echo of gunfire. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. We weren't in a sanctuary. We were in the throat of a Chicago winter. The sub-zero wind hit me like a physical blow, a wall of ice and needle-sharp snow that instantly stole the breath from my lungs. My thin waitress uniform offered no protection against the blizzard, the silk fabric clinging to my skin like a cold shroud. "Keep your head down and stay in the shadows of the brickwork," Jae-Hyuk commanded, his voice a low rasp against the howling gale. He didn't look back to see if I was following. He knew I had no other choice. The alleyway was a narrow canyon of grime and ice, lit only by the sickly orange glow of a flickering street lamp at the far end. My work shoes skidded on the frozen slush, my ankles rolling over hidden debris. But Jae-Hyuk's hand remained a constant, grounding force on my arm. He moved with a focused, predatory urgency, his eyes constantly scanning the fire escapes above and the dumpsters ahead. Behind us, the service door groaned as it was kicked open. There, by the loading dock, a voice screamed, barely audible over the wind's roar. The first shot didn't sound like a gunshot. It sounded like a whip cracking against the brick inches from my temple. Dust and red clay sprayed into my hair. Jae-Hyuk reacted instantly, spinning around and returning fire with a calm, clinical precision that made my stomach flip. 2 sharp barks from his weapon sent the silhouettes in the doorway diving for cover. "Run, Amara!" We bolted toward the mouth of the alley. The snow was falling so thick now it felt like a white curtain, blurring the world into a smudge of gray and charcoal. My lungs burned, the frigid air searing my throat with every desperate gasp. Every shadow looked like a hitman. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The adrenaline that had carried me through the kitchen was beginning to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep, shivering exhaustion. As we reached the street, the blizzard intensified, the wind whipping the snow into blinding vortices. A black SUV skidded around the corner, its headlights cutting through the whiteout like the eyes of a monster. For a terrifying heartbeat, I thought it was them, the men Nare had promised would finish us. Jae-Hyuk stepped in front of me, his body a shield of dark wool and lethal intent, his gun leveled at the windshield. The vehicle drifted to a halt, the tires screaming against the black ice. The door flew open, and a man I didn't recognize shouted a name I couldn't hear over the gale. "Go. Inside now." Jae-Hyuk shoved me toward the open door. I scrambled into the leather interior, the sudden burst of warmth from the heaters feeling almost painful against my frozen skin. Jae-Hyuk dived in after me, slamming the door just as a volley of bullets peppered the reinforced glass. The thuds were dull, heavy, the sound of a war being kept at bay by inches of armor. The driver floored it, the SUV fishtailing before the tires found purchase and propelled us into the heart of the storm. I collapsed against the seat, my teeth chattering so hard I couldn't speak, my hands covered in a mixture of rice dust, grease, and a dark smear of blood that I realized wasn't mine. I looked at Jae-Hyuk. He wasn't looking at the road or his men. He was looking at me, his intense, dark eyes searching mine for a sign of breakage. The invisible life I had led was miles away, buried under the snow of a Chicago alley, and as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold through the frosted glass, I knew the girl who had started this shift would never be seen again. The transition from the freezing Chicago night to the sterile, silent warmth of the safe house was jarring. The SUV had left us in an underground garage beneath a nondescript high-rise, and now the heavy steel door of the apartment clicked shut, sealing out the sounds of the city and the echoes of the hunt. The adrenaline that had been my only fuel for the last hour evaporated, leaving my limbs heavy as lead and my mind a fractured mosaic of muzzle flashes and white rice dust. I sank onto a leather sofa, my teeth finally beginning to chatter in the quiet. The apartment was a fortress of glass and shadow, overlooking a skyline that felt 1,000 miles away. Jae-Hyuk didn't go to the bar for a drink or pick up a phone to call his remaining loyalists. Instead, he disappeared into a back room and returned with a medical kit and a basin of warm water. He knelt on the floor between my knees, his movements stripped of the predatory violence I'd witnessed in the kitchen. He was still in his ruined suit, his white shirt stained with the soot of the explosion and the dark spray of the men who had tried to kill him. "Give me your hand," he said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a request, low and resonant in the stillness. I held out my right hand. The skin was sliced open in 3 places from the olive oil bottle I had shattered over the hitman's head. I hadn't even felt the pain until now. Jae-Hyuk dipped a cloth into the warm water and began to dab at the dried blood and oil. His touch was clinical, yet there was a devastating tenderness in the way he picked out the tiny shards of glass with a pair of tweezers. "I killed him," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "The man in the kitchen." I didn't even hesitate. Jae-Hyuk paused, his dark eyes lifting to mine. The intensity there was suffocating, a mirror of the world he lived in. "You didn't kill him, Amara. You survived him. There is a difference, though it feels the same when the blood is still wet." He applied a stinging antiseptic, and I winced, my breath hitching. He didn't look away. He waited until my breathing leveled before wrapping my palm in clean white gauze. "The Gilded Lotus is a crime scene now," he said, his voice dropping into a somber register. "By morning, Juno's men and the police will have scrubbed every inch of that cellar. They found the note, Amara. They saw you leave with me. They know your face, your name, and where your father is sleeping tonight." The air in the room suddenly felt as thin as it had in the wine vault. "I can go back," I insisted, though my voice lacked conviction. "I have a shift tomorrow. I have exams. I have to." "You have nothing but a target on your back," he interrupted. He stood up, towering over me, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the city lights. "The girl who served wine at table 1 died in that kitchen. If you walk back into that life, you walk into a grave. My brother doesn't leave loose ends, and Nahare will want your tongue for what you wrote on that receipt. I looked down at my bandaged hand, the white fabric a stark contrast against my skin. I thought of my textbooks, my small apartment, the invisibility I had cherished. It was all gone, burned away by 7 words, and a choice made in 45 seconds. Jae-Hyuk reached out, his thumb brushing the line of my jaw, tilting my face up so I had to look at him. I told you that in my world, we keep what we protect. You saved my life. In exchange, I am taking yours. Not to end it, but to rewrite it. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, shimmering clarity. I wasn't a waitress anymore. I wasn't a student. I was a passenger in a war that had only just begun, bound to the man who was currently the only thing standing between me and the dark. What happens now? I asked. Jae-Hyuk's grip on my chin tightened slightly, a promise and a threat all at once. Now, he whispered, we show them why it was a mistake to leave the king alive. The snow began to fall over Chicago exactly as it had a year ago, covering the city in a deceptive, pristine white that hid the jagged edges of the world beneath. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the flakes swirl against the glass. In the reflection, I barely recognized the woman looking back. The cheap polyester waitress uniform and the frantic, exhausted eyes of a nursing student were gone, replaced by a gown of midnight silk and a gaze that had learned to look at monsters without flinching. A year ago, I was invisible, a ghost moving through the gilded lotus, defined only by the speed of my service and the weight of my father's medical bills. Now, the world couldn't help but see me. My father was safe, resting in a private facility with the best care Jae-Hyuk's empire could buy, and my own name was whispered in the same breath as the man who had rewritten my destiny. The door to the study opened, and the familiar, steady rhythm of footsteps crossed the room. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. Jae-Hyuk's presence always felt like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me back against the heat of his chest. You're thinking about that night, he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my hair. I'm thinking about the girl who wrote that note, I said, leaning my head back against his shoulder. She was so terrified. She thought the world was ending because a few chandeliers shattered. Jae-Hyuk turned me in his arms, his dark eyes searching mine with that same predatory intensity that had once paralyzed me. Now it was the only thing that made me feel truly alive. And now I know that the world doesn't end, I replied, tracing the faint, faded scar on his jaw where a glass shard had caught him during our dash to the alley. It just changes hands. The war that had begun in the dry storage room had been brutal. Juno and Nare were gone, scrubbed from the city's history like a stain, but the victory hadn't been clean. We had spent months in the shadows, rebuilding the Kang Empire from the ashes of betrayal. I had traded my stethoscope for a seat at the table, learning the intricate, lethal mathematics of power. I had learned that mercy was a luxury, but loyalty was a currency. Some people would say I corrupted you, Jae-Hyuk said, his thumb brushing my lower lip, that I turned a healer into a queen of shadows. I smiled, a small, sharp expression that would have frightened the girl I used to be. You didn't corrupt me, Jae-Hyuk. You gave me a weapon when the world only gave me a tray. You made me a survivor. There's a difference. He kissed me then, a slow, deep seal of the life we had built together. Outside, the blizzard howled, a reminder of the sub-zero night that had forged us. The enemies would always be circling, looking for a crack in the armor, waiting for the king and queen to stumble. But as I looked out over the frozen lake, I knew we wouldn't. I had started that night with 45 seconds to make a choice. I had chosen a side, and in doing so I had stepped out of the shadows and into the fire. The Gilded Lotus was a memory, but the empire we ruled was very real. We were the monsters and the survivors, the king and the queen of a city built on concrete and secrets, and it all began with a single receipt and 7 words that changed everything. Inside the penthouse, the air was warm and still. Outside, The city slept, unaware that its heart now beat to the rhythm of the woman they had once ignored.